Hi folks, this is Tony at TravelScoot again. Okay, today we're going to show you something a little more in depth. We are going to replace the tire on the motor side of the scooter. We're going to remove the entire hub motor assembly with the tire, open it up carefully, pull the tire off, and install a new tire. Reassemble it, and there are definitely a couple things that you need to look out for. This may not be something everybody wants to tackle. It's not that complicated, but it's a little bit involved. These are the tools that you're going to need for the process. You're going to need your Allen wrench toolkit that's furnished with the TravelScoot, a little pair of wire cutters, a flat blade screwdriver or something else relatively small to pry open the motor with, a 19mm Allen or open end wrench, or for that matter a 3/4 inch wrench works the same, and an 8mm either wrench or socket. Step 1, take your 8mm wrench, whether it's a socket or an open end or box end wrench, and loosen the brake cable on the left rear wheel. It's best to, well, this one's already fairly loose, it's best to apply a little bit of brake pressure to hold it steady. Loosen the lock nut. Don't let the cable slip out all the way. You don't need that. When it slips pretty much to the end, go ahead and snug it up. Not tight, but just enough to prevent it from slipping out. Step 2. Using the second smallest Allen wrench in your toolkit, remove the 2 Allen head bolts that hold your brake band in place. Now, step 3, just take the brake band assembly as it is, with the cable still in place, and just set it out of the way. You can loop it around the controller cable or something like that. Get it out of your way. Now you're free to work on the rear wheel. Next step, take your little cable cutters and cut these 2 cable ties. There's one in the rear, right there, and there's one at the front of your battery tray, I should say. One in front of the yoke receptacle and one at the rear. Just cut them, and you'll be able to remove the cable ties that hold the motor and controller cable to the frame. In the next step, we're going to take the scooter and tip it on its side without throwing it off the table, maybe. These are the cable ties that we cut. That exposes the connector that connects the controller and the motor. This is a weather-tight connector. It takes a little bit of force to separate it. Remove the outer axle bolt using the largest Allen wrench in your toolkit. Simple enough. Next step, remove the plastic cap protecting the motor cable and the axle nut on the inside of the fork. And take your 19mm wrench, loosen the nut far enough to where you can slide the washer out of its receptacle. You will need to pry on the fork a little bit. I can do by hand, but you may need a lever like a screwdriver. And remove the motor and wheel assembly. In the next step, we've got the motor removed. There is a washer on here. It usually stays in place, but be mindful that you don't lose it. Turn the motor on its side, and taking the 4mm Allen wrench, remove the motor hub screws, of which there are 4, and they each have a lock washer. Okay, now the next step, and this is a big one, you want to pry the motor core out of the ring gear housing. You'll see what I'm talking about in just a second. Taking your flat blade screwdriver, get it between the flange of the inner motor core housing, ideally where the locating pins are. You have 2 locating pins opposite one another. As you can tell, you've got 2 holes, 1 hole, 2 holes, 1 hole. And this may take a little effort, especially if your assembly is a little bit older. Lift everything out carefully, and voila! The motor core is here. Set it aside, and that exposes your wheel assembly with the tire. The next step is to remove the old tire by pushing against that. If you made up with a bunch of resistance, you can also take a mallet and tap out the ring gear housing and remove the tire that way. By the way, this tire is not particularly bad. I'm just going to set it aside and take a new tire, make it look a little more realistic. Take the new tire. It's going to be a snug fit. Slide it in place. And you take your motor core assembly. Be sure to match up the locating pins with the outer housing. And you will also feel a little bit of misalignment initially between the bearing that is on the opposite side, so be sure you feel it nestle in place. At this point, I would recommend, even though you're not completely together, inserting the housing screws at least loosely to hold things in alignment. Now what we'll do is we'll tighten these evenly in a crosshatch pattern, as it's called, going across the center. That way you make sure to keep everything in alignment. You keep everything engaging properly and nothing gets skewed and snagged. Next step, reinstalling the wheel. Make sure that the cutout in your motor axle assembly is facing forward, so your motor cable faces forward. This would obviously not be good. Back the nut off so you have enough clearance. Slide the flat of the axle into the flat here. Now on the opposite side, pull the face, or the cheek of the fork away so you can get the axle inserted. Shove it forward. Make sure that the tab on the washer is inserted into the keeper hole, if you want to call it that. Hand tighten. You can install your outer axle nut whenever. Just going to set it there for now. And very important, tighten the inner axle nut using your 19mm wrench. Next step, very important, make sure that these two white alignment marks are in alignment. These 9-pin connectors do have a little bit of resistance, but the weatherproof connection there is much tougher than the pins. You will not feel the pins go together. So if you're misaligned, you're going to bend the pins. Shove it together, set it in place, and cinch up the tie wraps. Replace the cap. Take your brake band assembly. Remember, it's still very loose. Slide it through like this. Take your brake screws, and if you've got the dexterity, grab one, and I recommend you start with the bottom one. Get the hole aligned, or in this case totally misaligned. Get it started. Grab the second one. Get it started. Again, second smallest Allen wrench. Second smallest. Insert and tighten. Next step, retighten the brake. This nut should not be too tight. Don't let go of the brake band, otherwise the cable might slip through. Snug it up. Tighten a little bit at first. Now apply a little bit of brake pressure. Hold it in place and tighten properly. Last step, test your installation.